introduce our next speaker, Professor Samir Okasha from Bristol, and his presentation, which is live, is entitled Teleonomy, Agency and Unity of Purpose. So over to you, Samir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dick. Thank you for inviting me. The themes of my talk today are firstly, teleonomy. Secondly, a contrast between talking about the goal of an activity or behavior and the goal of an organism. Thirdly, and relatedly, something I call the organism as agent concept, the idea that some organisms either are or can usefully be treated as if they were agents, in a sense to be made explicit. And fourthly, a requirement that I call the unity of purpose requirement on applying this organism as agent concept. So I'll start out by saying a few words about teleonomy. By this, I understand the idea that an organism exhibits goal-directed activities and processes associated, as we've heard, with Pitt and Drake and then Ernst Meyer, among others, and was meant to be a sort of slimmed down version of teleology, as Dan has explained in his talk, that's both fully naturalistic and compatible with Darwinism and compatible with the idea that the evolutionary process itself, of course, has no goal at all. I think it's useful to start with a quote from Ernst Meyer in a paper discussing the notion of teleonomy. He says the following, he says, goal-directed behavior in the widest sense of this word is extremely widespread in the organic world. For instance, most activity connected with migration, food getting, courtship, ontogeny, and all phases of reproduction is characterized by such goal orientation. This was an idea very much around in the mid-20th century. So earlier, Monod had written that one of the most fundamental characteristics common to all living things is that of being endowed with a project or purpose, while earlier still Waddington had talked about directiveness, stating that most of the activities of a living organism are of such a kind that they tend to produce a certain characteristic end result. A little bit more about Meyer's views. So notice that Meyer includes under the scope of this notion of teleonomy both activities or behaviors of the organism, such as courtship, for example, and internal processes, such as gametogenesis, for example. So it has a broad scope. Then Meyer went on to argue, as we heard yesterday from Peter, that an evolved genetic program initiates and guides the goal-directed activity and encodes the goal, and that a process of feedback ensures that the goal is achieved despite possible perturbations. Meyer thought that the genetic program and thus the goal-directed activity was innate, but allowed that in some cases where behavior was concerned, learning may play a role too. Now, Meyer emphasized ultimate explanation when discussing teleonomy, since he insisted that teleonomy was only applicable where there was a genetic program, the genetic program was evolved. And that may be right, and ties in, of course, with the observation that goal-directed behavior is usually adaptive. But I think it's worth noting that very often we can identify the goal of some organismic activity or behavior without reference to evolution, as when we say, for example, that the goal of the salmon's migration is to return to its natal stream, something that could be discovered and would be true, even if creationism turned out to be right. I'll come back to ultimate and proximate later. Now, from today's perspective, I think that Meyer is quite right that goal-directedness is a real phenomenon in nature. And there's not something that's simply in the eye of the beholder, and there's not merely anthropomorphism gone too far. But of course, his characterization of the phenomenon is questionable, and particularly his notion of a genetic program, as we heard in Dan's talk again, could be questioned and has been on multiple grounds. So I want to leave that aside for the moment, just run with the idea that goal-directedness of the sort Meyer talked about is a real phenomenon. My interest is in something slightly related but a bit different, and it's really with a certain way of describing some of the phenomena that count as teleonomy for Meyer, in particular organismic activities and behaviors. And the mode of description I'm interested in is one in which we treat the organism as an agent, and we identify the goal of the activity or the behavior in Meyer's sense with a goal of the whole organism. And this, I think, is not merely, although it is, a linguistic phenomenon, but also ties in with a characteristic pattern of biological explanation. I want to emphasize the contrast between thinking or talking about the goal of an activity and the goal of an organism. And I think it's striking how often we talk the latter way. So imagine someone, either a casual observer or a biologist, observing the courtship ritual of a bird of paradise, the migration of a salmon, an ant following a pheromone trail, for example, where clearly some apparently purposive behavior is being performed. The immediate thing that you're going to ask on observing those behaviors is to say, look, what's the organism doing? And the natural way to answer that question is to say what the organism's goal is. It's to say, well, look, the bird of paradise is trying to attract a mate, the salmon's trying to return to its birthplace, the ant is trying to find the food source. And this is a subtle semantic shift, but I think an important one, and one that is absolutely pervasive. And to see how pervasive it is, note that many of the descriptors that we use when we're thinking about and talking about animal behavior are goal imputing. Not just animal, but plant behavior too. So terms such as fleeing, warning, hunting, foraging, all contain an imputation of goal directedness, indicative of which is that talk of success makes sense here. You can ask, has the behavior been successful? Now, many descriptions that you give of biological and other phenomena are not such that talk of success does not make sense. So this picks out a specific subset where there's an imputation of goal directedness. Note that these descriptors are ones that we predicate of the whole organism, not some subsystem within it. And note that when we apply these descriptors, we explain, or potentially they allow us to explain an organism's behavior to respond to the question, what's it doing, by describing it in a certain way. And this is a fairly familiar phenomenon in general philosophy, that sometimes you can explain something by describing it in a particular way. And when we give descriptions of animal behavior by using such goal imputing descriptors and attributing a goal to the organism, we engage in a mode of explanation that has a close parallel with a mode of explanation we apply to human action, when we explain a person's action by saying what the goal or intended goal is. As when I say, for example, he's whispering in order to avoid disturbing the baby, by way of answering the question that why isn't he speaking audibly? I say because he's trying to avoid disturbing the baby. Now, in this sort of example, of course, the goal is mentally represented and is part of the agent's conscious motivation for performing the action. Not so in most of the biological cases that I'm concerned with. But despite that, I regard these modes of explanation as the ones that involve conscious intention as being a subtype of the more general mode of explanation of an action by citing its goal. So these are species of a common genus, if you like, the ones that do and that don't involve conscious intention and mental representation. And armed with that claim or that thought, and the idea that there's a clear parallel here between explaining what an organism is doing by saying what its goal is and giving this sort of explanation using folk psychological explanations of human action. This leads me to what I call the organism as agent concept, which is the idea that we can sensibly treat an organism as having goals having interests, making decisions, choosing which actions to perform, trying to achieve certain ends, modes of description that, of course, we would never ever apply outside of biology, to inanimate objects. And in some cases, even knowing, believing, wanting certain things. And of course, this immediately raises the question, a perennial one in philosophy, about whether these are metaphorical usages or not. I want to sidestep that very difficult question, but I will say one thing about it, which is that the organism as agent concept has a weak and a strong version. In the weaker version, we just talk about an organism trying to achieve a goal, as when we say that, bacterium is trying to reach the area of higher oxygen concentration, and so is moving in a particular direction. But in the stronger form of the organism as agent concept, we talk about the organism desiring or wanting a certain end and knowing how best to achieve it. And in this usage, we talk about the organism as if it really were an intentional agent in the philosophical sense, equipped with beliefs and desires and processing information and deciding what to do. And this mode of description, I think, is appropriate, even if not literally true, whenever we have not just goal-directedness, but sufficient behavioral flexibility and learning for it to gain purchase. The organism as agent idea is found in both proximate and ultimate contexts. In the proximate context that I've already talked about, a typical question we're trying to answer is, what's that organism doing? And we give the answer by using one of those goal-imputing descriptors that talks about what the organism is trying to achieve. It's trying to find the food. In the ultimate context, we're typically concerned with questions such as, why do organisms behave that way? And the organism as agent concept gets a grip here too. So, for example, one might ask in an evolutionary context, why do worker bees eat other workers' eggs in a social insect colony? And the answer might be, well, they want to ensure that only the queen's progeny are raised because they're more closely related to the queen's progeny than to the progeny of other workers. And that, of course, isn't literally true, I take it, in that the true explanation of why the workers do that is chemical, not psychological, but nonetheless, it's an extremely natural way to express an adaptive explanation, a point that Daniel Dennett has often emphasized. What theoretical significance, if any, attaches to this shift from goal of activity or behavior to goal of organism? Is it a mere façon de parler? And I want to investigate this question in an ultimate context in relation to evolutionary explanations, although I think that what I have to say does apply equally to the usages of the organism as agent concept in a proximate context. And by way of focusing the issue, I want to consider the following skeptical challenge. Suppose someone says, well, look, what does the organism as agent concept and associated idiom achieve that could not be more simply expressed using the language of adaptive significance or function that, of course, is pervasive in evolutionary biology? So, for example, instead of saying the mother rat knows that its weak offspring won't survive and doesn't want to waste resources, so decides to eat them, we were simply to say, look, the function of the rat's infanticidal behavior is to prevent resources being wasted on a non-viable offspring. I mean, aren't those different ways of saying the same thing? So what, if anything, is to be gained by what significance attaches to the former way of speaking that employs the agential idiom and that treats the mother rat as akin to a rational human agent? Well, my response is the following. Treating the organism as an agent with a goal in this context of evolutionary explanations is in fact quite significant and is not always equivalent to talk of function or adaptive significance, despite appearances, because it rests on a crucial presupposition, the organism as agent idiom, rests on a presupposition, one that's usually satisfied, at least approximately, but the fact that it does rely on this presupposition becomes apparent when we consider cases where it's not satisfied. And the presupposition is what I call the unity of purpose requirement on attributions of agency. To set the stage for this argument, note well, it's traits that have functions or behaviors that have functions, but it's organisms that pursue goals, try to mate, send signals, perform actions, have preferences, etc. Now you may say, well, so what? Well, this helps to bring out an implicit theoretical commitment of the organism as agent concept and the associated set of descriptors that I've talked about, which is the following. To treat an organism as an agent with a goal and or to apply folk psychological descriptors like believes, knows, wants to the organism, it must exhibit a unity of purpose, which means that all of its traits, or at least most, must contribute to a single overall goal, such as maximizing survival or maximizing reproductive success or genetic contribution to the next generation or something like that. Because otherwise the organism, as we'll see, can't sensibly be treated as agent-like. And I think that this point applies quite independently of the question of whether these goal-imputing descriptors and this agential language is taken literally or not. That's why I sidestep that question. But function talk doesn't have this commitment. And to bring this out, I'll just say a little bit about unity of purpose in human agency. Unity of purpose, as I understand the term in relation to human psychology, means that an agent's intentions and motives don't conflict, and that their actions cohere with their goals, or that they're instrumentally rational, if you like. So intentions and motives not conflicting. I mean, if I intend to catch the 8 p.m. train, I can't also intend to stay in the pub until 10 p.m. And this sort of unity and coherence of action with goal is essential for purpose of action, and I think of as both a broad psychological fact about humans that holds for the most part, not always, and a presupposition of applying psychological attributions in the first place. But it can break down, and for example, in cases of multiple personality disorder, then it precisely does break down. Well, we've got more than one person, if you like, inhabiting a single body. And it's a familiar observation that psychological descriptors lose their grip in such pathologies. Now, this psychological unity of purpose, I maintain, has a biological analog, and the biological analog is the point that organisms' traits should have, and usually do have, complementary rather than antagonistic functions, and that when that doesn't apply, then the language of agent, the organism as agent concept can't work and will only mislead. Here's one example to illustrate this. Consider the following of the phenomenon of cytoplasmic male sterility in flowering plants, in which mitochondrial genes cause those plants to abandon pollen production to the detriment of the plant, because they usually need to be able to self. But genes in the mitochondria cause the plant to cease making pollen. But in some cases of cytoplasmic male sterility, they do still grow stamen. It's just the stamen don't make any pollen. So in that case, then we can give a functional explanation for the production of stamen, for why the plant grows stamen. We can say, yeah, they're for making pollen. And we can give a functional explanation for why no pollen is produced, in terms of the mitochondrial genes which gain from that, because they're only, of course, transmitted maternally. But these traits have antagonistic functions. We can't think of the plant as a whole as a unified agent trying to achieve a particular end, because the two behaviors pull it in opposite directions. So the organism isn't pursuing a single goal and is disunified to that extent. So on the left here, we have a plant, note the shortened stamen, which don't produce any viable, any pollen. A second example, also involving intragenomic conflict, from the fruit fly, in which males carrying a certain X chromosome variant in some fruit fly species produce no Y-bearing sperm at all. And obviously that's good for the genes on the X chromosome, Not so good for the organism as a whole, because it drastically reduces the number of viable sperm that are made. So again, the fly then is, as an organism, is characterized by traits that pull it in completely different directions. On the one hand, it does a complex set of courtship actions. On the other hand, it doesn't produce the amount of sperm that it could otherwise have produced. You know, so the first trait sort of is aimed, has the goal of maximizing reproductive success or achieving a certain level of reproduction, and the second one impedes that goal. So the fly is like a victim of split personality. And if we try to treat it as an agent and to treat the goals or the functions of its different traits as contributions to some overall goal, we won't be able to understand what we see. My final example of the same thing comes not from intragenomic conflict, but from parasitic manipulation. So think of an ant infected by a liver fluke parasite. One of many examples of intriguing examples of parasitic manipulation of animal behavior. So ants infected by this parasite climb to the top of a blade of grass each evening and clamp themselves there. And this raises the chance of the ant being ingested by sheep, which is just what the parasite needs to complete its life cycle. So the ant again exhibits a partial unity of purpose. You know, some of its behaviors pull in the direction of maximizing survival and reproduction. Other of its behaviors, climbing to the top of this blade of grass, impede that goal. So again, you can't think of the ant as a unified agent. It's not characterized by unity of purpose. So my moral then is that to treat an organism as agent-like and to apply these descriptors to it, to talk in terms of an organismic goal rather than the goal of the individual activities or traits, requires a kind of consistency of purpose, which means, in the ideal limit at least, that all traits must contribute to a single overall goal, and empirically that requires the near absence of intragenomic conflict. And this I think of as a biological analog of the point that real human agents shouldn't have conflicting intentions, both try to achieve X and Y, where those are incompatible. A somewhat different way of putting my point is this. I mean, folk psychological descriptors, such as knows, believes, wants, tries, presuppose a kind of consistency of purpose and a rationality on the part of the agent, in that where that's not found, they lose their grip. So they presuppose that the agent's goals cohere with each other and fit with the actions that the agent performs. Similarly, I say organisms can only usefully be treated as agent-like, whether in the weaker sense in which we just talk about what they're trying to achieve, or the stronger sense in which we credit them with psychological, we apply these psychological descriptors to them, if biological analogues of these attributes are present. And this then requires a biological unity of purpose, which empirically requires the absence of too much intragenomic conflict and the absence of phenomena such as parasitic manipulation. I mean, a related point is this. Think again of that contrast between the function of the trait and the goal of the organism. This is a biological analog of a well-known contrast in philosophy of psychology between the subpersonal and the personal. To see that contrast, notice that we say that it's the cerebral cortex that processes visual information, but it's the person who sees the car coming and moves out of the way. Now, folk psychological notions are personal level, and when used metaphorically in biology, as in when we apply the organism as agent idiom, they apply to the whole organism, not its parts or traits. Another angle on the same point. Consider the following locution: the function of such and such a trait is X, and the organism has the trait in order to achieve X. Now, ordinarily, those two are equivalent. I mean, the function of the cactus's spines is to deter herbivores, and the cactus grows spines in order to deter herbivores. Those say the same thing, surely. But not if unity of purpose fails. I mean, the function of ceasing pollen production is to promote mitochondrial transmission. But the organism doesn't cease making pollen in order to achieve this. Indeed, in a very real sense, I would say that ceasing to make pollen is not something that the organism does, but something that's done to it by a kind of genomic parasite, if you like. And similarly with the case of impeded spermatogenesis in the fruit fly. So the conclusion I want to draw then is the following, that, I mean, if you come back to the question of what's the point of using this organism as agent notion, and whether it's just willful anthropomorphism, I say that it's not, because there are objective biological facts that the organism as agent concept tracks, at least in the ultimate context, in the context of giving evolutionary explanations and of casting adaptive explanations in this agential idiom. And the objective fact that that usage tracks is the near absence of within-organism conflict and the resulting unity of purpose, without which it doesn't make sense to treat the organism as agent-like, and without which the attempt to understand its behaviors in terms of the organism's goal rather than the behavior's function will not succeed. So therefore, I say it's not idle metaphor, nor misplaced anthropomorphism. And this point can be appreciated by thinking of cases where the presupposition fails, namely where too much intragenomic conflict is leading the organism as a whole to be a disunified agent. And of course, there's a limit to how much of that you're going to be able to observe, because organisms wouldn't exist unless they were pretty good at suppressing the amount of internal genetic conflict, which is the empirical precondition for this unity of purpose, which itself is the precondition, the sort of conceptual precondition, if you like, for talking about the organism as agent-like and applying these psychologically inspired descriptors to it in an as-if sense, of course. And I'll leave it there. So the argument I've just rehearsed is an argument found in the first chapter of my recent book, Agents and Goals in Evolution, if anyone is interested. Thank you very much. And that's me finished.
Well, thank you very much, Samir. It was beautifully, clearly presented and very interesting. I suppose my immediate reaction was love to have a debate about how long a particular species or population, which consisted largely of disunified organisms, would persist in a living system. Anyway, we're not allowed to have debates now, I'm afraid. We've got a couple of minutes before the next talk, which is from one of the members of the team of the program committee for this meeting, James Shapiro. His talk is pre-recorded and we'll start in a couple of minutes, precisely at the half hour. That's 3:30 p.m. here in the UK. I hope that's okay, Jim and Padma, that we can start this now in 90 seconds or so. Thank you. Okay, Padma, I think it is actually now 3:30. So can we go ahead with Jim's presentation, please?
When I finished assembling this presentation, it became clear to me that Teleonomy and Genome Change was not an adequate title. So I've tried to give you an idea more of what I'm trying to get at by the new title, which is Engines of Innovation. Genome change and evolution is not accidental. All life naturally exists in a variable ecology, which changes over time. And it adapts to it genomically at different levels and on different timescales. So regular physiological changes within limits require short-term fluctuations, which are the products of regulatory networks and do not create heritable differences. Epigenetic changes, changes in the way the DNA is packaged and can be expressed, occur over a longer time scale. They can be linked to cellular differentiations and multicellular development. And they also can reflect or record episodic events in the lifetime of an individual organism. And sometimes these changes can be passed on to offspring through the gametes. And that happens without changing the DNA sequence, but with an inherited change in DNA compaction and packaging within the nucleus. There are also programmatic changes which occur in the genome for organisms which need to vary their characters for a variety of reasons in reproducible and reversible ways. So these include phase variations, where organisms shift between two different phenotypic phases for different environments. For example, a pathogen may have one phase for free-living existence out in the external environment, and a different phase for infection of the host, the target host. Or certain pathogens, for example, undergo antigenic variation, where they reversibly can alter the proteins and antigens on their surface and thereby escape the immune system. Yeast cells can change their sex or mating type by altering a specific region of their genome and thereby produce diploid populations from haploid spore progeny. And there are, of course, things like the more elaborate systems like the adaptive immune systems in vertebrates, which change each generation to provide an endless array of receptors for different invaders. The heritable changes, the major heritable changes to the genome fall in two different categories. They are microevolutionary genomic changes, which adapt isolated characteristics of the organism. The classic example, of course, is wing coloration in the peppered moth, where during the Industrial Revolution it changed from white to black, and that was caused by a transposable element inserting into a locus controlling wing pigmentation. These changes don't alter the species or the taxonomic relationships of the organism, just individual traits. Macroevolutionary genomic changes, however, are different. They change the structure of the chromosomes, and because of the rules of meiosis and sexual reproduction, that generates a new taxa by chromosome incompatibilities. And also, macroevolutionary changes can change the phenotype in more extreme ways to meet major challenges like population decline, loss of food source, mass extinctions, and even an exposure to lethal agents like antibiotics, pesticides, and chemotherapy. The distinction between microevolution and macroevolution can be seen as described very well in Henry Hang's recent book, Rethinking Genetics, Evolution, and Molecular Medicine. Although mainstream evolutionary theory attributes hereditary variation, which is the raw material for evolutionary change, to accidents with the genome, mistakes in genome replication and distribution. In fact, cells have a variety of systems to keep such accidents to a minimum. They have proofreading DNA polymerases, which can remove any incorrect bases when they're can sense the incorporation of the wrong nucleotide, back up, remove the incorrect nucleotide, and then proceed to carry on polymerization with the correct base in place. Sometimes when there are misincorporations which escape the proofreading process, there are post-replication mismatch repair systems which can detect mismatches in the genome and remove the newly incorporated incorrect nucleotide and resynthesize that strand to restore the proper nucleotide at that position. And this can happen either by removing a single base, that's called base excision repair, or by removing an oligonucleotide on that incorrect strand and replacing that stretch of oligonucleotide. That's called nucleotide excision repair. Homologous recombination can restore errors. And when DNA double-stranded breaks occur, there's a relatively non-mutagenic process of non-homologous end joining, and that can rejoin the broken ends together. Sometimes it results in chromosome changes in rearrangements, but very little sequence change occurs. As the cells go through their cell cycle, there are checkpoints at virtually every step of the way to make sure that the genome is distributed and duplicated properly. In cases where the genome has been damaged, there are cell death routines in place, programmed cell death, so that those cells with damaged genomes are removed from the population. And in prokaryotes, there are systems to recognize the entry of foreign DNA into the cell and to destroy it by nucleolytic cleavage, such as restriction and modification systems and CRISPRs. While they work to remove damage and mistakes in genome replication, living organisms do respond to genome damage and to various stresses, including physical damage and chemical damage, by repairing their genomes, and they try non-mutagenic error-free repair initially, depending on processes such as homologous exchange and the base and nucleotide excision repair I explained in the previous slide. But also, if the damage is severe, it induces a mutagenic or error-prone repair process. And these processes, these error-prone repair processes, are responsible for the vast majority of genetic changes, heritable genetic changes in genomes. So there are inducible non-proofreading DNA polymerases called translesion mutator polymerases, because they can replicate across from chemical lesions in the complementary strand, and mutators because since they don't have proofreading, they introduce changes into the sequence. And one of these polymerases in E. coli, for example, is responsible for 99% of all spontaneous mutations. So the mutations don't arise from accidents, they arise from the action of these cellular proteins. Similarly, in eukaryotes, and we'll see this in detail, Double-strand break repair can occur by so-called alternative end joining processes. And these are different from the canonical non-homologous end joining processes. And these involve a certain DNA polymerase called theta, or POLQ, and as well as other polymerases. And they go through a series of events that we'll look at in more detail called microhomology-mediated template switching, reverse transcription, and untemplated polymerization and chromosome restructuring. And can make very dramatic changes in the genome. And finally, there's also processes, naturally occurring built-in processes for genome reorganization. So there's activation of natural genetic engineering functions, various protein systems which cut and splice DNA, activation of mobile genetic elements, mobile DNA elements, and latent endogenized viral genomes, which can generate change. And then there's a process called chromoanagenesis, which are rapid, massive, multi-site chromosome restructuring that occur rapidly in plants and animals within a single cell generation. We know about these massive chromosome restructuring processes initially because we observe them in real time in cancer cells. And later they have been found to occur in animal and plant germlines as well. This slide illustrates one of the original papers on these multi-site rearrangements in the genome. This is a process called chromothripsis, which literally means chromosome shattering. And it was first observed in cancer cells, but it's subsequently been documented in the human germline and in plants. And what chromothripsis is a series of changes in a single chromosome, or sometimes a small number of chromosomes, in a single region. So here's what's called a circoplot of the 24 human chromosomes, 22 autosomes, plus 2 sex chromosomes. And the orange lines indicate interchromosomal DNA rearrangements, and the dark blue lines indicate intrachromosomal chromothriptic changes that occur. And in this colorectal cancer cell here in panel A, there have been 239 rearrangements, all on chromosome 25. On chromosome 15, excuse me, on chromosome 15. In panel B, it's a thyroid cancer, which has 77 rearrangements on the short arm of chromosome 9. Here is a renal cancer, which has 52 rearrangements of chromosome 3. And here is a lung cancer cell line, which has 85 copy number variations on chromosome 8. So these are limited to generally a single chromosome, and there are massive changes, numbers of changes within a small region. A completely different picture is presented by other cancers. This slide shows a completely different pattern called chromoplexy, which means chromosome weaving. In chromoplexy, a small number of chromosomes in the karyotype exchange, go through multiple exchanges with each other. And the exchanges are limited to those chromosomes and to specific regions on those chromosomes, as you can see in the figure. Panel A shows us a chordoma genome, which has 147 rearrangements, which involve chromosomes 3, 4, 7, 8, and 9. Chromoplexy is different also from chromothripsis in that chromoplexy does not lead to copy number changes. whereas in Chromotrypsis, there's replication and loss or gain of copy numbers of the regions involved in rearrangements. In addition, chromoplexy takes place during interphase, during at times of periods of active transcription, apparently, whereas, as we'll see shortly, chromotrypsis occurs during mitotic division. What is the significance of this, these two patterns? They affect only a small subset of the 23 human chromosomes, and in any one individual, any one human cell. And why is that significant? Well, it's significant because the involvement of only a small part of the genome, a small part of the karyotype, tells us that they are highly non-random in the genome. That means that they're the products of organized cell activity and not the results of errors or accidents, because those would have a more normal distribution throughout the genome. The fact that there are at least two different signature patterns, and in fact there are more, is evidence that there exists more than one evolved, complex, four-dimensional cellular genome repair and restructuring system capable of generating such clustered, distinctive, and highly non-random rearrangements. We understand chromotrypsis the best, and that occurs when a chromosome error, distribution error, or broken chromosome leaves a fragment off of the mitotic spindle during mitotic cell division. And in one of the daughter cells, that fragment is enclosed in a micronucleus. And in this figure, you can see the micronucleus as that small red dot at the left, and the rest of the nucleus, which is partially undergoing replication because of the green pigment, is to the right. What we're going to see is a time-lapse video of this happening. And what you'll see is that the nucleus replicates, and then the chromosomes condense and start to form along the mitotic spindle. And at that point, the DNA in the micronucleus starts to replicate, turns green, and it shatters into many, many pieces, which continue replicating. And those are the pieces which are later reassembled into a chromotrypsis product. And let's see how what this looks like in time lapse. So chromotrypsis occurs at the time of mitosis, whereas chromoplexy occurs during interphase when the cells are undergoing transcription. A major source of the changes in these chromotryptic rearrangements is DNA polymerase theta, which is responsible for alternative end joining, and a rather remarkable amount of genomic innovation during mutagenic chromosome repair. And we know that this is important to the cells and is evolutionarily conserved because it's widespread among the eukaryotes. So it's found in yeast, in pathogenic unicellular protozoan parasites like Leishmania, trypanosomes, and Plasmodium. It's found in a single-celled alga, chlamydia, Chlamydomonas. It's found in both moss and higher plants like Arabidopsis and rice. It's found in all animal groups, in invertebrates, a nematode, insect, and even a black tiger shrimp. It's found in chordates, in a tunicate, and it's found in vertebrates, amphibians like xenopus, birds like chickens, and mammals like us. DNA polymerase theta is a really remarkable protein, and it does amazing things to the genome, but it's a very fundamental protein of the cell. It's what carries out alternative end joining when non-homologous end joining fails. So Pol theta can carry out double-strand break repair, and in the absence of non-homologous end joining functions, or in the absence of homologous recombination functions, polymerase theta becomes an essential protein for the cell. So it's a basic part of the cell maintenance apparatus. It has polymerase and helicase domains. It can displace homologous recombination proteins and take over break repair from homologous recombination functions. It can insert novel sequences or scars at the sites of alternative end joining. And these were observed very early on in people looking at these double-strand break repair products. It can process the ends of broken chromosomes to allow them to be repaired. And it is able of creating new sequences in at least 3 different ways. First of all, it has robust terminal transferase activity, both from the 3' end of DNA and the 3' end of RNA, so it can generate untemplated de novo DNA sequences. Secondly, polymerase theta can reverse transcribe RNA and promote RNA templated DNA repair. So it can introduce retrocopies of RNAs into the repaired genome. And third, it engages in frequent intrachromosomal, and less frequently interchromosomal template switching at the break site, where there are what are called microhomologies of only 1 to 6 nucleotides. And it generates chimeric fusion sequences and copy number variations, which are quite remarkable, as we'll see shortly. So this slide shows a diagram of some of the activities of Pol theta, but not all of them. It indicates Pol theta and using its terminal transferase activity to create new sequences, completely new sequences by non-templated DNA extension. It can fold back on itself and recopy in inverted orientation the same sequence over again. It can jump from one template to another, and so it can extend itself in a templated fashion on DNA in trans, and then it can return to non-templated extension. And finally, it can come back to templated polymerization to complete double-strand break repair after all of these genomic gymnastics. In the same study where we saw the micronucleus fragment and replicate DNA that's going to become products, chromotryptic chromosomes later on, they sequenced many of these chromosomes. And in addition to the variability of having different fragments of the large fragments of a chromosome joined together in novel ways, they noticed that at the junction sequences, there were what they call tandem short template rearrangement signatures. And what that means is that the polymerase can jump from one template to another. So here's one case where there are 6 different regions on chromosome 3 where rearrangements occurred. And the polymerase can start in the red region, polymerize a few hundred base pairs, and then hop to the black region and polymerize several hundred base pairs. It can then hop to this purple region, and then to the blue region, and then back to the black region, and then back to the red region, and back to the orange region, then back to the red region again at 2 different sites, and back to this green region in the center. So these patches are, the median size of them is 185 base pairs, and they're all joined together at the junctions. So this creates a great deal of novel DNA sequence, in addition to the untemplated and reverse transcribed sequences I told you about. In addition, in a renal cell carcinoma cell, they found the same template switching pattern showing interchromosomal exchange between chromosome 3 and chromosome 5. So they have a junction which begins at this point in chromosome 5, hops to this segment of chromosome 3, hops back to the original hotspot in chromosome 5, then hops back to a different spot in chromosome 3, comes back to a different place in chromosome 5, and then hops back to a different place in chromosome 3, and from chromosome 3, it can move to this location in chromosome 5, and so forth and so on. So not only does this polymerase jump between templates on the same chromosome, but it can jump between templates on different chromosomes as well and create karyotype rearrangements. So what are we to make of all of these genome change capabilities that we see in exemplified by Pol theta, but it's by far not the only operator which can restructure the genome in eukaryotic cells. I think we can draw the following conclusions and make a hypothesis. Living organisms have 3 major goals: survival, growth, and reproduction. They use genome change systems to overcome ecological challenges of various degrees of seriousness and predictability. Episodically, living organisms are confronted by insurmountable ecological challenges. What can they do in that case? And I think we can postulate that when confronted by an insurmountable challenge, living organisms use their inherent genome change operators, which we've just seen illustrated, to attempt rewriting their genomes in order to survive, grow, and reproduce as new life forms. In other words, to evolve. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. Fantastic. I got a new term from there, genomic gymnastics. quite a remarkable series of processes you've laid out for us there. Thank you very much indeed. Very interesting indeed. Our penultimate talk in the formal part of the 2 days is to start now. It's a recorded talk. It's by Stephen Talbott of the Nature Institute at Ghent in New York State, and it's entitled Towards a Thoughtful Teleology Beyond the Hollow Organism. So if you could start the video, Padma, I'd be grateful.
Well, hello, everyone. I can hardly tell you what a privilege it is as a kind of outsider to find myself addressing this remarkable gathering. But I fear I'm about to abuse the privilege because I really doubt we can meaningfully talk about our theme of purposiveness in the context of today's biology. I can only hope that for a few moments you will join me in stepping outside that context. One might have thought that any exploration of purposiveness or teleology would require attention to the interior aspects of life. By interior, I refer, for example, to thought, intention, feeling, and will, together with the field of consciousness upon which we humans are able in self-awareness to think, intend, and so on. There's one thing we can say about our interior life. It constitutes an evolutionary achievement we know from the inside. Our wide-awake, self-aware experience provides the first inner space within all the kingdoms of life on Earth, where evolution can rise to consciousness, reveal its true nature, and even submit to our direction. What if it is here, where life gains consciousness, that we find our most intimate and significant connection to the life of organisms in general? But don't you have a nagging sense that the language of interiority and purposiveness we instinctively apply to organisms is dangerous if taken too seriously? Most biologists seem to think it unnatural, as if we were somehow being tricked into continually misspeaking. As far as I can tell, the main worry is that such language all too readily suggests psyche, soul, entelechy, or other untouchable ideas. The root of the problem, which unfortunately I can barely allude to in this short talk, is an entrenched Cartesian dualism. René Descartes' cleaving stroke through the heart of reality has been almost universally accepted, perhaps most of all in biology. We live with the violence done to the unity and harmony of the world by that stroke, and merely choose which half of this improbably fractured whole shall we accept and which half reject. And so the material that materialists accept is dualistic material, just as the mind or interiority they reject is dualistic interiority. It seems a shame that biologists have hardened their preference for the remnants of Cartesian dualism at a time when physics has long since become open to diverse views about matter and consciousness. In 2005, Richard Conn Henry, a professor of physics and astronomy at Johns Hopkins, published a piece in the journal Nature entitled "The Mental Universe Without Causing Any Evident Disturbance." Likewise, cognitive scientists pursuing consciousness studies engage in wide open debate encompassing just about every school of thought, including non-materialist schools. If only biologists could enjoy such freedom of conversation. In any case, the problem of dualism will not be my primary focus, apart from the fact that nearly everything I say will run up against it. And as a result, one or two things I say may appear stunningly outrageous. But you might wonder, why make such a big deal of it? Doesn't natural selection explain everything? After all, those organisms most efficient at surviving and reproducing get selected. That's why they seem to have purposes. Thanks to natural selection, they just can't help being goal-directed towards surviving and reproducing. And since selection is a natural process, we needn't worry about real purposiveness or thoughtfulness, let alone souls or entelechies. So it's easy, right? And yet everything we mean by natural selection, namely the generation of trait variation, the complex processes of inheritance and reproduction, and survival amid the vicissitudes of life, these are already purposive, indirected activities. So what explains this purposiveness? After all, the question isn't how does an already purposive organism become incrementally more so? We want to understand how purposiveness can first arise or exist in a wholly natural world. Look, goal-directed performance can hardly be considered as just one more trait selected by evolution. It's a precondition for anything that looks at all alive and capable of participating in processes of trait selection. So we want to know how purposiveness is wholly natural before we start thinking of selection. Few seem to share these concerns, but it does seem obvious that when we do finally reject the appeals to natural selection, we'll need to begin thinking about purposiveness in entirely new ways. But whatever the case with natural selection, don't machines show us how organisms can be purposive? No. I'm far from the first to point out that machines are designed and organized from without, while organisms are enlivened from within. An abacus, a threshing machine, a cruise missile, all their purposiveness lies in the externally imposed arrangement of parts reflecting our purposes, and none of it is intrinsic to the machine. The machine's parts show no living tendency out of their own nature to grow together in that way. Our ideas are not immanent in its parts. If you want eminence, then scramble the cells in the limb buds of an amphibian embryo. Then watch the embryo as a whole adapt those cells to the inherently developing form. Scramble parts of a machine, on the other hand, and it breaks down. An organism, unlike a machine, is not physically determined by the preceding moment's arrangement of parts. So it requires, I think, some overzealous philosophizing to convince ourselves that there is an important principle for biology in the mechanistic character of a cruise missile. The 20th century cell biologist Paul Weiss gave us what we might call the fundamental theorem of biology. In any cell or other biological system, the variance of the entire system is less than the sum of the variances of its part processes. So the many degrees of freedom of the parts at any level of observation must be causally constrained by the coherence of the larger whole. Weiss wrote, "A cell retains its identity far more conservatively and remains far more similar to itself from moment to moment than one could ever predict from knowing only about its inventory of molecules, macromolecules, and organelles, which is subject to incessant change, reshuffling, and milling of its population." This situation, Weiss pointed out, is the opposite of a machine, where deviations of the lower level parts from their predefined roles tend to accumulate and cascade toward catastrophe at higher levels. If you're thinking, well, a cruise missile is surely goal-directed and corrects its course using feedback, then I'm afraid you are taking the engineer's point of view, not the machine's. Yes, the machine-imposed design is purposive and will be reflected in the machine's performance, so long as it is working well. But variance in the functioning of the parts, which include the feedback mechanisms, will have a very different effect compared to the dramatic variances a cell and organism can tolerate, for example, in its gene expression networks. That's because the missile's apparent intentions are not immanent in the machine itself. Or try to picture some 300 molecules in a spliceosome. In loose association, they carry out a long sequence of operations to reconstruct an RNA molecule in one of many possible ways, all in accord with current needs of the cell. Where are the coordinating computer instructions or the gears and levers directing each of those 300 molecules to its proper place in the watery milieu and to its proper interaction partners? It's an impossible thought, so why do we think it? By the way, I do understand that the word mechanism today often refers merely to lawful physical interaction. This habit of expression makes it easier to associate physical lawfulness with machines. But clouds, though physically lawful, are not machines, nor are rocks and rivers, nor is cytoplasm. If only biologists using the word machine were required to say what they mean beyond lawful physical interaction. The only thing distinguishing a machine from physical objects generally is the human purpose artificially imposed on the arrangement of parts. So anyone who feels the need to draw on the idea of a machine rather than lawful objects unmanipulated by human intelligence is probably invoking human purposes under the table, even if unwittingly. But now, with human purposes, we come to the heart of the matter. It seems that while we are free to imagine organisms chock full of machines, information processors, and cybernetic devices, all of which import the human interior into the organism, any actual reckoning with this conscious interior is taboo. This problem of consciousness is vast and far beyond managing in the brief time remaining. Here I offer only a few bald assertions, mere gestures toward ideas I hope may intrigue you. The sum of it is that I see no way for biology to face up to teleology until it comes to terms with the human interior in relation to the living world as a whole. So my first bald assertion, the human interior goes all the way down. When a pianist plays a Beethoven sonata, the infinitely complex movements of her fingers, arms, and whole body must somehow express her intentions. On any particular occasion, say a funeral or wedding, she may inflect her interpretation so as to yield a slight shift of character and mood. This means she will modify all those complex movements in an almost unthinkably nuanced manner. The result is an utterly refined physiological realization of her intentions, all the way down to the finest details of gene expression. These must vary for the sake of the performance from one cell to the next over trillions of cells. So you tell me, do we in this picture find any break between the pianist's conscious effort to realize her expressive intentions and the unconscious expression of those intentions at the molecular level? Is not every cell of her body informed by her thoughts, feelings, and intentions? This despite the fact that no cell thinks, feels, or intends in any way we would want to call conscious. Second bald assertion. The relation between the unconscious and conscious is an intimate one. We can think of the unconscious, rather paradoxically, as consciousness that is not conscious. That is, the unconscious lies along a large and varied spectrum of consciousness. Unconscious contents can potentially rise to consciousness, just as conscious contents can fall into the unconscious. The boundary is extremely porous. Can anyone who is reasonably self-aware doubt that a good part of the meaning and motivation of his behavior is less than fully conscious? It's hard to deny the recognizable character of thought, will, and intention along this entire spectrum. And I see no reason to think this unity disrupted anywhere between our fully conscious intentions and the cellular processes that yield so seamlessly to our higher activity. And don't we already have a psychosomatic view of the human being? It's not only that cancers, heart disease, peptic ulcers, and other ailments correlate to one degree or another with stress, personality type, or psychosocial circumstances. The effort to distinguish purely physical from psychosomatic disorders is widely viewed as obsolete, since it is now difficult to find any physical illness whose onset, course, and treatment, think of the placebo effect, are not influenced by interior factors. When we consider that an almost unfathomable intelligence is already at work in the zygote, for example, in the very processes through which the future brain will be formed and begin to function, it seems rather rash to regard the conscious intelligence with which we employ our brains as absolutely separate from that earlier brain-forming intelligence. It's not clear how we might even speak coherently about the presence of fundamentally disconnected intelligences at play within the unity of an organism. Third bald assertion. Possessing and being possessed by consciousness are very different things. An organism can consciously possess its own thinking and intentions, as we do when we are self-aware and directing our own interior processes. Or it can be possessed by those processes, in which case we must speak of the unconscious. Now, the intelligence by which we are possessed can be of very different sorts. Consider how you drive a car with reasonable alertness while your mind is fixated on that pizza joint you passed an hour ago. Or consider the artistic sensitivity taking possession of the cells in the pianist's fingers. And then, especially in other organisms, there is the profound and wide-ranging intelligence of instinct. The bird building a nest is not consciously preparing for its unborn offspring. Yet obviously it is preparing for its unborn offspring, and I do not know how we can avoid accepting both statements. The first step to such acceptance may be to see that the bird is possessed by the wisdom that plays through it. It's as if its life is sustained by the voices of a larger wisdom, a wisdom born upon the eloquent currents of wind and sunlight, the ruling powers of day and night, the compelling because unreflective meaning of songs, drum beats, and alarm calls. The philologist Owen Barfield, a student of the evolution of consciousness, had in mind this distinction between possessing and being possessed by consciousness when he said that we humans had first to be spoken by language before we could become conscious of that language and make it our own. Peering back toward the prehistoric age of myth, he wrote, "It was not man who made the myths, but the myths, or the archetypal substance they reveal, which made man. We shall have to come, I am sure, to think of the archetypal element in myth in terms of the wind that breathed through the harp strings of individual brains and nerves and fluids." I did warn you about outrage, but before you succumb to that reaction, you might want to ask yourself, where, without the Cartesian influence, would the outrage lie? Is there any reason, in light of all the foregoing, not to recognize in our reflective intelligence an internalization, a conscious possessing of some part of the intelligence that formed and continues to inform our physical bodies? Then too, why was it the universal human experience until several centuries ago that we ourselves were microcosms of the larger psychophysical cosmos, and that we lived in a world of beings rather than things? What have we missed by dismissing such experience wholesale in favor of the wreckage of Cartesian dualism? My fourth and final bald assertion: every living being is a becoming, a unity in time. The bird building a nest clearly has a different relation to time than we do. It lives a well-planned life without planning anything, as if its future is somehow integral to its present. We humans occasionally have a bare hint of this overcoming of separate moments of time. We have it, for example, in the experience of flow, when an athlete, musician, or speaker goes unconscious, as we say, and becomes so intensely present in the moment that he seems to transcend it without conscious effort or planning. Things just happen, and in an unusually effective way. I believe that many Eastern and other wisdom traditions emphasize entering into the moment with such intensity that it becomes a kind of eternal now, bringing with it an ability to act out of a larger trans-temporal unity. Mysterious as this may seem, this line of thought offers, even if on an altogether lower level of consciousness than selfhood, a way to begin thinking about the nest-building bird's equally mysterious life. It needn't plan for its offspring, because the temporal unity of its life and way of being is not fragmented into separate moments. The study of embryology and development shows every organism to be a unity, not only because every part is informed by the coherent reality of the whole spatial organization, but also because every moment is informed by the recognizable character of the whole life cycle. In this regard, the development of an organism displays something of an archetypal nature. Unfortunately, the Cartesian mind finds it hard to comprehend an archetype as a kind of muscular organism of thought, that is, a dynamic, generative idea capable of unfolding in time as the form of material substance, which is too bad for science, because this meaningful coherence of an idea or form materially unfolding in time looks like nothing less than what we normally take to be a principle of causality. It's easy to forget that all scientific understanding takes the form of ideas of one sort or another. Certainly mathematical formulae are ideal, and if they occur in the scientist's mind as physical laws, it is because they are recognized in the form of inanimate phenomena. As ideal forming principles, they belong to the interiority of the world. But of course, the thought aspect of physics, with its universal character, can hardly be the same as that of the organism as a more or less locally centered agent. What is needed is simply to acknowledge the ideas of form or organization declaring themselves, for example, in every embryological sequence and broader life cycle. It is hardly surprising that these ideas are as different from physical laws as organisms are from rocks. The way of being or archetypal nature of an organism is no more occult or mystical than the laws of physics, even if organic ideas require, like all ideas, a method of recognition appropriate to their character. So back to the bird building a nest. We, for our part, have fallen out of the time unity of that bird's life. We must consciously plan things. This enables us to insist on our own way, for good or ill, rather than be carried along by unconscious currents of life. This is the space where we gain our freedom. And so we assemble the moments of our lives in a pattern of our own choosing, rather as we spatially assemble the parts of a machine according to our conscious purposes. In both cases, our capacities might seem dreadfully artificial compared to the unmechanical life of a bird, living each moment in harmony with the governing unity of its life. This artificiality, no doubt, helps to explain our ability to play the role of destroyers on Earth. But our current freedom also holds hope, given the possibility that we might, for the first time and in full consciousness, lay hold of the creative powers through which evolution has occurred, while also accepting our own responsibility for the Earth's future. And having gained our freedom, might we eventually move beyond tinkering with things from without and beyond planning our future while isolated in the present moment and cut off from the wider intelligence that has nurtured all life on Earth? All this might suggest that our distinctive human consciousness can be seen as the highest achievement of consciousness on Earth to date, but also a form of consciousness not yet equal to the unconscious wisdom possessing the simplest one-celled creature. We certainly have room for a further evolution of our consciousness, which in fact appears to be the leading edge of evolution today. I do not believe we can reclaim the living organism without first unapologetically reclaiming ourselves. This means accepting the fact of our own interiority, through which alone we can understand organisms and their evolution. Then we may begin to discover the connection between our highest functioning, the intelligence of the cells in our bodies, and the entire creative drama of life on this planet. And I would like to thank you all for being such a quiet and attentive audience and never interrupting me even at my most outrageous.
Wow, some very profound thoughts there. I love the musical example. I was thinking about Goethe as we went along, entering into the moment. Unity in time. There are those who consider consciousness, which has of course come up earlier in our conference, as the most challenging of all scientific inquiries, the nature of consciousness itself. And there are those who believe that consciousness is intrinsic to matter, and therefore, again, that surely is something worthy of debate. Well, we're almost at the half hour. Thank you very much, Stephen, if you're still out there somewhere. We're almost at the end of our session, the last paper, and it's a very special privilege for me to introduce Denis Walsh. Unless I've missed something, Denis last spoke to the Linnean Society in our meeting room in London 10 years ago. Perhaps I've missed something in between. At that time, he was going to originally to talk about affordances, and they came up yesterday several times. And then he changed and talked about the Weissman barrier or the pseudo barrier. That came up today. And today we also heard much about agency, issues surrounding that. And in 2015, Denis published a very significant book on that very subject. But today, so I'm looking forward to what he's going to cover today in what seems, again, by serendipitous accident, going by alphabetically organizing our talks, a very fitting end to the formal part of this conference. Denis's title, very succinct compared with almost everything else we've heard, is Teleophobia. So over to you, Denis, and fantastic to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dick. And this is the talk advertised, unlike our last meeting. I guess I should share my screen. Keynote, is that it? Oh, come on. Nope. Sorry, I'm having some difficulty sharing here.
Do you have your presentation open, Denis?
Yep, and it's the only thing it's open. And it wants me to open system preferences.
Are you on a Mac?
Yeah.
Is it a new one?
No, well, reasonably. Okay, so, Sorry about this.
No problem.
Okay. Let's see, share screen. Oh, I've got something.
Great. Yes, all good.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I apologize for the glitch. So thank you so much for the invitation to this really wonderful meeting, and amongst all these illustrious speakers. I'd really like to thank Dick and Peter for thinking of me in this context. I really appreciate it. I'd also like to thank previous speakers in this in this series, especially Dan Nicholson and Denis and Raymond Noble, for putting my talk in context. And the context is this, that it seems evident from what Denis and Raymond said that somehow or other teleological thinking seems to be indispensable in biology. As Ludwig von Bertalanffy says, we can't even think about organisms without thinking in terms of purpose and teleology and the like. And on the other hand, teleology somehow seems to be illicit, right? So there's this tension here. And so what do we do about it? Well, one thing we can do is we can try and coin a new concept that bridges the distance between our evident need for teleology and the fact that we can't have it. This is what the concept of teleonomy, as Dan Nicholson told us, was an attempt to do. And on the other hand, what we could do is we could face up to, we could address it face on this claim that teleological explanation is illicit in the sciences. And that's what I'm going to do today. And you'll have noticed that I've taken some editorial license already and taken the scare quotes away from on purpose in the conference's title. That's because I think there's a genuine case to be made for real scientific explanations that appeal to purposes. Okay, so here we go. This is Thomas Hobbes. Now, you'll be delighted to hear that Thomas Hobbes has nothing to do with this talk, except for the fact that in the Leviathan, he tells us that fear and I were born twins together. And I think if the concept of teleonomy were to write its autobiography, it might start in the same way. Teleonomy was born out of fear. And so Thomas Hobbes was afraid of the Spanish Armada. And teleonomy was born out of fear of teleology. And what I want to do today is to try and kind of dissipate this fear of teleology, to address some of the misapprehensions about teleology and make a claim that it's a genuine mode of scientific explanation. So here we see a passage from Colin Pittendrigh in which the paper in which teleonomy was first coined. I think we saw this passage quoted by Dan. Pittendrigh says, it seems unfortunate that the term teleology should be resurrected and, as I think, abused in this way. Biologists' long-standing confusion would be more fully removed if all end-directed systems were described by some other term, like teleonomic, in order to emphasize that the recognition and description of end-directedness does not carry a commitment to Aristotelian teleology as an efficient cause principle. Now, many of the misapplications or misapprehensions of teleology are packed into that passage. And in, I'm going to, sorry, I have to do it this way. In a correspondence with Ernst Meyer, he says that I wanted a word that would allow me to, oh, excuse me, I have to go out of full screen. Allow me, all of us biologists, to describe, stress, or simply to allude to, without offense, this end-directedness of perfectly respectable mechanistic system. Teleology would not do, carrying with it the implication that the end is causally effective in the current operation of the machine. So what this concept is meant to do then is to give us a descriptor, a way of describing or acknowledging the fact that organisms are end-directed systems, but not to implicate their end-directedness in giving genuine explanations. So maybe I could do, I'm having trouble with this. Okay, maybe that will help. Right. Oh, that's better. Now, so somehow or other, it kind of splits the difference, as Samir suggested, between genuine teleology and acknowledgement of the goal-directedness of organisms. It's not teleology. So what is teleology and what's so bad about it? Why is it that we have to avoid it at all costs? Well, teleology is a mode of explanation. It's a mode of explanation in which the nature or occurrence of an entity, by which I mean an event, process, or structure, is explained by citing the goal or the purpose that it subserves. I'll use goal and purpose interchangeably for these purposes. Now, I want to make a special point here of saying that teleology in its canonical uses gives us token explanations. A teleological explanation explains of a system why it's doing what it does by appeal to that system's goals. Now, there was a movement in the late 20th century to replace teleological explanation as a token explanation with a kind of type explanation in which we explain the prevalence of a type, say a character trait, by appeal to past consequences of prior tokens of that type. Now, that's not a teleological explanation. That's an etiological explanation. There's been an enormous literature on this, but basically it doesn't do what a genuine teleological explanation does. So at the outset, I'd like us not to conflate these etiological explanations with genuine teleological explanations. A teleological explanation explains by appeal to purposes or goals. Okay. Now, there are a number of reasons adduced for thinking we can't have teleological explanations. There are three general kinds of reasons or arguments against teleology. There are historical arguments that basically tell us that teleology is outmoded, it's a scholastic throwback. There are conceptual arguments, these will be the important ones, that tell us that teleology as a mode of explanation is somehow incoherent. And there are pragmatic arguments that say, look, teleology has been superseded by mechanisms, so we no longer need to appeal to goals to explain anything. Mechanism, everything has a mechanistic cause, so mechanism leaves no unexplained residues. that for teleology or gaps for teleology to fill. Okay, so let's go through these arguments in turn. So we've heard a fair bit from René Descartes already today, and over the last few days, couple of days, René Descartes is credited with being the great figurehead of the scientific revolution, who threw over this scholastic Aristotelianism and told us that in order to pursue our sciences, we should look for the causes of motions, the causes of things. And he explicitly eschews teleological explanations. So in the Principles, he says this: we will never derive any explanations concerning natural things from the ends that God or nature had in mind when creating them. We shall entirely banish from our philosophy the search for final causes. So there's an explicit statement, an explicit anti-teleological statement from Descartes. But we should be very careful about what it actually says. What he's banishing here is what we might call global teleology, the very idea that all of nature is a manifestation of God's plan. Moreover, he banishes this form of explanation not on the grounds that it's incoherent or unavailable to us, but on the grounds of piety. It's kind of hubristic to suppose that we can reach into the mind of God and find out what God is thinking. So that's one of his motivations for banishing teleology. But we should notice that in what we might call biological contexts, the context of human biology, Descartes is perfectly willing to engage with teleological explanations. This is a point that was made beautifully by Alison Simmons in a 2001 paper. She says, look at his account of the purpose of sensations. He says in the Meditations, without a doubt, sensations are, properly speaking, given to me by nature in order to signify to the mind what things will be beneficial or harmful to the composite of which it is a part. So the idea there is perception or sensation is there to monitor the world and to send messages to the mind so that the mind can plan the preservation and the proper action of the organism. And we might think that, well, this is just kind of ersatz teleology or heuristic teleology, but no, he goes on and he says he really means it. He says, he talks about malfunctions. And one of his examples is dropsy, the condition in which one is inclined to think one needs to have to drink when one doesn't. And he says, with respect to the composite, that is the mind united with the body, what is involved is not a mere label. This is when things go wrong, when there are malfunctions. We're not just labeling it a malfunction, but a true error of nature, namely that it is thirsty at a time when drink is going to cause it harm. So this malfunction is a real feature of the world. It's a real feature of the world or the biological reality in us because the proper function of the sensations are real features of our biological reality. Okay, now, as Dan, so one thing that this might do for us is it might cause us to rethink this historical claim that somehow or other the scientific revolution banished teleological thinking. And of course, teleological thinking never went away in biology. At the inception of what we think of as biology, the biologists of the Jena group, Herder and Goethe, they thought that the life was a purposive process. And to understand organisms, we have to understand how all their systems contribute to the performance of this purposive process. And teleological thinking was alive in biology throughout the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And Dan Nicholson has done some really wonderful work showing the role that teleological thinking played in organicism. So these historical arguments against teleology might not have the weight that we think they do. Now, I'm not so motivated by the historical arguments. I mean, after all, teleology may have been wrongly expunged from our worldview or wrongly kept in our worldview, and it's just a matter of historical fact. But I'm more compelled, and I think others are more compelled by the conceptual arguments against teleology. And there are three kinds of conceptual arguments. Well, I'll call them the argument from non-actualia, the argument from intentionality, and the argument from normativity. Okay, So here's the argument from non-actualia. So teleology, on this view, requires that goals cause their means to occur, but goals are in the future when the means occur. So some non-actualized state of affairs, a future state of affairs, would have to cause some actual state of affairs to occur, and that's impossible, that's incoherent. But there's an obvious response to this, that this argument against teleology conflates causation with explanation. It says teleology requires future states to cause present states, but that's no requirement on teleology at all. Teleology only requires that future states explain present states. So unactualized states of affairs cannot cause actual events, but they may nevertheless explain them. The argument from intentionality goes like this. Look, in order to bring about a goal, we have to have a representation of that goal occurrent in our minds in a time. So teleology, acting for a purpose, requires representing or thinking about the goal. And this is a common objection against teleology. And the response to that is that it conflates two of the grand traditions in teleological thinking, the Platonic and the Aristotelian. So in the Timaeus, Plato tells us, well, there are only two kinds of causes in the world. There's chaos, or the wandering cause, and that can only cause chaos. And then there's intentional cause, the intention of the demiurge, and that's what causes regularity in the world. So in order to explain regularity, we need intention. But of course, we don't think about regularity in those ways anymore. In the Aristotelian tradition, Aristotle says, well, look, there are these things in the world, organisms, and they are imbued with this capacity to take matter and to arrange it in a form that allows the organism to discharge its life functions, its bios. And we can see that organisms have this capacity to direct these processes towards attainment of their goals. And we don't have to see them thinking in order to see this is happening. So in Physics 2.8, he says, it's absurd to suppose that purpose is not present because we do not observe the agent deliberating. So we don't have to see thinking going on in order to recognize purpose. And there's another argument, the argument from normativity, that says teleology requires goal states to be intrinsically normative. Now, I'm a little short on time, so I'm going to skip this one. I want to make the point and come back to it if there's time. But this is just a mistake. It conflates the notion of ought with a related, similar sounding notion called normative requirement. Ends normatively require their means, but that doesn't mean that the goals themselves are intrinsically good or they ought to occur. Okay. So these responses to the standard objections to teleology do not develop or make a positive case for teleology, but they allow us to generate some desiderata for an account of teleological explanations. So the requirements are that goals explain their means, and yet goals are not causes. Goals do not cause their means. Goals are not intentional representations, and teleology appeals to the conduciveness. It's a good-making feature of a teleological explanation that it shows us that the means that were implemented were a good way, were appropriate for the attainment of the end. That's what I mean by normative requirement. Okay. So what is a goal? First, we need an account of what a goal is. Well, I've undertaken recently to try and say something true in every talk. So here's my candidate for today's truth. The goal-directed processes are directed towards goals. Now, that seems trivially true, but we can also use it as an account of what a goal is, because goal-directed processes are actually observable things. They're dynamic properties of the system. They happen when a system has a repertoire of activities that they can implement, and they implement those repertoires that by and large bring about their goals. And goal-directedness has an observable signature. So when Dan and Gunnar were talking about persistence and plasticity, this is part of the signature of goal-directedness. So we can observe goal-directedness. We're very good at detecting goal-directed processes, and goals are just the end states of goal-directed processes. So we see these goal-directed processes in behavior, in metabolism, in the immune systems, in development, in gene regulation and repair, as we've seen in James Shapiro's talk. So now that we know what a goal is, it's the end of a goal state, how can we use goals to explain their means? Well, we can answer that with a similar sounding question. How can causes explain their effects? Now that may sound like a stupid question because it's obvious that causes can explain their effects. Well, yeah, but not all causes explain their effects. We need a particular relation between cause and effect in order to explain an effect by appeal to a particular one of its causes. And this relation is invariance or modal dependence. So James Woodward says, the sorts of counterfactuals that matter for purposes of causation and explanation are just such counterfactuals that describe how the value of one variable would change under interventions that change the value of another variable. Now, maybe that's a little bit hard to understand, but here's a little depiction of it. We have a cause and effect relationship, say C causes E. And when C causes E and C explains E, there's a particular kind of relationship between the value of this variable C and the value of E. Call this relationship constancy and systematicity. And it means something like this. If we were to intervene on C to give it a different value, then we would find a change in the value of E, right? Oops, sorry. And this change in the value of E signifies a constant invariant relation between C and E, cause and effect. And this relation is systematic. Changes to C bring about systematic and predictable changes to E, to the effect. So, but the same relation holds between goals here, G, and their means, only it's time reversed. So we have this means towards attainment of a goal here, M causes or brings about G. Now, suppose we intervene on G, give the system a different goal, what will happen? We'll get a systematic change in M. The system will bring about some new value of M, and that new value of M will be systematically related to G in such a way that it will be appropriate to bringing about the goal. That's what goal-directed systems do. They bring about the means that are appropriate to the attainment of the goal. So in the cause-effect relationships, effects are modally dependent on their causes. And in the means-end relationship, means are modally dependent on their goals. And it's the same kind of modal dependence. It's modal invariance. Now, invariance is the relation that allows causes to explain their effects. So invariance then must be the relation, or should be the relation, that allows ends to explain their means. So explanations in general cite modal dependencies. Goals explain their means in exactly the same way that causes explain their effects. They do so by exploiting modal dependencies. Okay, so teleology is possible then because teleological relationships instantiate the same relationships that cause and effect do, in virtue of which causes explain their effects. Okay, so if we're going to allow causes to explain their effects, we should allow goals to explain their means. But that leaves open the question whether or not we have a genuine need for teleology. So the pragmatic argument says every event has a causal or mechanical explanation, so there are no unexplained residua required for teleology. There's nothing left for teleology to explain. And so teleological explanations are otiose. We don't need them given our mechanical scientific worldview. Well, this may not be true either, because causal and teleological explanations have this property I call miscibility. They apply to the same things, right? Causal and mechanical explanations can apply to the same system. So a system, the dynamics of a system can be explained in two ways: by citing the causes of its activities, or by citing the goals of its activities. These are two kinds of explanations, and they're complete in the sense that neither can be improved by adding the other. You don't make a causal explanation any better qua causal explanation by saying, oh, furthermore, the effect is a goal. But you don't make a teleological explanation any better by saying, and here's how it happened. So they're non-competing. They explain different things about the system, and one can't be replaced with the other without explanatory loss. You can't explain why an event came about by citing how it came about, and vice versa. You can't explain how it came about by saying why it came about. And so these two forms of explanations are complementary. Each explains something. Where we have goal-directed systems, each explains something about the dynamics of that system that the other form of explanation doesn't. And this is because causal and teleological explanations exploit different invariances. So we've seen this before. If you intervene on a cause, you'll get a systematic difference in the effect. But what do these different effects have in common? Or if you change the conditions under which the cause act, you'll get a systematic difference in effect. What do these systematic differences in effect have in common? They're all instances of the same causal invariance relation. They're all effects of the values of Ci, the cause.
Denis, 4 minutes.
Thank you. I think I can make it.
Good.
Likewise. So if you intervene on, the goal, you will get different means towards the goal. Or if you hold the goal the same and you change the conditions, you will get different means towards the goal. So you get M1 or M2 or M3. So what do M1, M2, and M3 have in common? Just like the causal relation, they're all instances of the same invariance relation. They're all ways of successfully attaining the goal GI. Okay, so, oh, I see, I got my slides mixed up. Okay, so then we have two kinds of explanatory relations here. We have causal explanatory relations, and these exploit the fact that effects depend on their causes. And we have teleological explanatory relations, which exploit the fact that means depend on their goals. But this is the same form of dependence. It's a modal dependence. And in fact, in goal-directed systems, what we have is something like this. The same activities get explained twice over. Once by appealing to the modal relation, the modal invariance that the effects S1, S2, S3 have on causes, and once by appealing to the modal relation that S1, S2, S3 have on the goals. So effects depend on their causes, means depend on the goals, and one and the same activity, one and the same occurrence can be both an effect of a cause and a means towards the attainment of a goal. Okay. So this kind of dual counterfactual dependence, the teleological and the causal counterfactual dependence, is evident throughout all biological systems. We see it in behavior, in perception, in immune responses, in metabolism, in development. We also see it crucially in the component processes of evolution. Ontogenetic responses like plasticity and robustness that Armin told us about, the origin of novelties, genome repair and regulation that James Shapiro showed about, phenotype construction and what we might call Umwelt management, the capacity of organisms to respond to their environments as affording or threatening their activities, their lives. So these are manifestations of the capacities of organisms to marshal the resources of their component systems in the pursuit of their goals. And I maintain we don't fully understand the dynamics of goal-directed systems unless we understand the way they operate in pursuit of the organism's goals. So take-home messages then, or teleology, is an acceptable form of scientific explanation. Like all scientific explanations, teleology invokes invariance relations. Where there are goals, there's teleology. Goals are natural states of affairs. There is a distinctive invariance that holds between goals and their means that's different from the invariance that holds between causes and their effects. And causal and teleological explanations are complete, complementary, and non-competing, and they're both natural. So please, no more teleophobia. So I think I'll stop there because time's up. And more importantly, I think England and Germany are about to kick off. So thank you so much for listening and having me.